So guys, to really understand what are the differences of time in Australia, we need to understand something called time zones. We need to understand something called time zones. And that basically means that at any given point in time, it's not the same time anywhere on the planet. I hope that makes sense to you. So right now, it's a different time in Sydney than it is in Adelaide, than it is in Perth, than it is in China. Okay, and this helps us to function as an interplanetary society. So why is it a different time? Why do we make it different times across the planet or even our continent? Well, guys, it's all about when the sun comes up. Okay, now let's look at why there's different times. Of course, you've got the sun, and I've drawn my little picture of the sun, and here's the sun, and the sun always rises in the east. So I've drawn a little compass point there as well. Okay? And of course, Sydney, here we are in Sydney, we're on the east coast of Australia, aren't we? So the sun always rises on the east, okay? The sun always rises on the east for everyone in China, in America. The sun always rises from the east, okay? And so that means if the sun is always rising in that part of the world, or for example, Sydney, if the sun is rising in the east, then it's got to be later on in the day than it is elsewhere. For example, if the sun is rising in Sydney, it hasn't risen in Perth yet, has it? Because the Earth is still rotating and the sunlight hasn't reached Perth yet. Okay? So we've got sunlight hitting Sydney, and then it hits Adelaide, and then the sunlight hits Perth. So it's got to be later on in the day for Sydney. So that means the Sydney times need to start sooner. I'm going to try and make this a little bit clearer. Let's imagine in Sydney it is 6 a.m. It is 6 a.m. in Sydney, and that means the sun has just risen and the sunlight is now hitting Sydney at 6 a.m. But of course the sunlight's not really at Adelaide yet, is it? Because the Earth is still turning. So in Adelaide it's actually 5:30 a.m. In Adelaide it's actually 5:30 a.m. We'll just get rid of that time for now. And of course, the sunlight is very far away from Perth. It's not even near Perth yet. In fact, in Perth, it is only 3 a.m. And of course, as the sunlight begins to crawl across Australia, well, it's later on in the day, so Perth will catch up and Adelaide will catch up. But by then, the sun is higher in the sky in Sydney. So you can see why we need these different time zones, because the sun doesn't hit all parts of Australia at the same time. In fact, all across the world we have different time zones. So today we're just concerned with Australian time zones. Today we're just looking at Australian time zones, not the rest of the world, just Australia. And it's really simple, guys. I've got a picture here and I'm going to show you how you find the differences between the time zones, okay? As long as you know the time in each city, given that at any particular point in time, you can then find out the time anywhere at any time in Australia. So, in Perth, it's 9 a.m. and I hope that you can see that. I hope that's big enough. I'll write it down for you, 9 a.m. In Adelaide, it's 11:30 a.m. 11:30 a.m. This is at any time, any given point of time. At Sydney, it's actually 12 p.m. Okay? And just knowing those 3 times with those 3 different cities, that allows us to work out the differences between the times in the cities at any given point in time. So we know that between Perth and Adelaide, Adelaide is plus 2.5 hours, right? Between Perth and Adelaide. Adelaide is plus 2.5 hours. We know between Adelaide and Sydney, Sydney is plus half an hour, plus 30 minutes. And given that, we really should be able to work out what time it is at any point in time, as long as we've got a time. I'll show you. Here's a good question for us. In Perth, let's imagine it is 3 a.m. In Perth, let's imagine it is 3 a.m. So if it's 3 a.m. in Perth, what time is it going to be in Adelaide? Well, this is the teaching phase of the video, so I'm just going to show you how to work it out. If it's 3 a.m. in Perth, 3 a.m., right? So there's Perth over here. And we've been asked what time it is in Adelaide over here. Well, we know the difference between Perth and Adelaide. We know the difference between Perth and Adelaide is plus 2.5 hours. So all we've got to do is plus 2.5 hours to this Perth time, Perth, right, that's 3 a.m, plus 2.5 hours, right, which is this figure here, plus 2.5 hours. 3 a.m. plus 2.5 hours is, of course, 5:30 a.m. And so the answer should be 5:30 a.m. Okay, we're still in the teaching phase. Let's do another one. What about if the time is in Sydney and it's 11:30 p.m? Well, what's the time in Perth? Well, remember, let's draw our lines again. Perth to Adelaide is plus 2.5 hours, isn't it? Plus 2.5 hours. And Adelaide to Sydney is plus 30 minutes. It's really important to do that to get it clear. Okay, so if we know in Sydney, see how I always write things down? You should write them down too. If we know in Sydney that it's 11:30 p.m, right, what's the time going to be in Adelaide? And this is going to involve some takeaway this time because we're going to have to go back this time, right? Now, we know that Sydney is 30 minutes ahead of Adelaide. So to get back to Adelaide time, we're going to have to do some takeaway because Sydney is 30 minutes ahead. So if Sydney is at 11:30 p.m, and that means it's 30 minutes ahead of Adelaide, we're going to have to take away 30 minutes, which should give us 11:30, take away 30 minutes, which should give us 11 p.m. So if Sydney is at 11:30 p.m, Adelaide should be at 11 p.m, because Adelaide's 30 minutes behind, isn't it? Adelaide's 30 minutes behind. So we should just write that down, 11 p.m. Okay, let's do another one. We're still in the teaching phase, and this one's a bit trickier, because this one's asking what is the time in Perth when it's 11:30 p.m. in Sydney. Okay, so let's draw our lines again. I think our lines are really helpful. Good mathematicians are good drawers, I tend to find. So Perth to Adelaide, again, well, we can see there's 2.5 hours plus difference there, plus 2.5 hours. It's important to do this. And from Adelaide to Sydney, it is again plus 30 minutes. Right? And we know the time given in Sydney is 11:30 p.m. So let's write that down. Sydney, 11:30 p.m. So we've got to work out the difference between the time between Sydney and Perth. And this time we're going to have to go backwards because Perth is actually back in time compared to Sydney. We're going to have to go backwards. So, and how much are we going to take away? Well, if we know that Sydney to Adelaide is 30 minutes, and then Adelaide to Perth is 2.5 hours, that means we've got to take away 30 minutes, and we've got to take away 2.5 hours, which is really saying we're taking away 3 hours. So the question is, what is 11:30 p.m. take away 3 whole hours? And the answer should be 11:30 p.m. take away 3 hours is, I think it's 8:30 p.m, isn't it? Yes, it is. 8:30 p.m. and that should be our time, 8:30 p.m. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Because Perth is, at 9 a.m. over here on our static map, and it's at 12 noon here, so Perth is 3 hours behind Sydney. Perth is 3 hours behind Sydney. And that's always true. Okay, now we're up to the together phase of the video, and we're going to do this one together. Now, let's read it together. You read it out to me. Go on, read this. I hope you said, what is the time in Perth when it is 9:36 p.m. in Adelaide? Okay, so what should we do first? We should probably draw the lines. So I'm going to draw those lines. You might want to draw them somewhere. Perhaps you need to draw a little quick map of Australia and draw those lines yourself. That's what I would be doing if I were you. So from Perth to Adelaide, we know it's plus 2.5 hours. And from Adelaide to Sydney, we know it's plus 30 minutes. So you should do that now, thank you. So make sure you've done that. Okay, now what are we going to do? We've got to find the time in whereabouts? Perth. And we've got the Adelaide time. So what's the first thing we do? Have a think about it. Maybe even do a sum. Have a go. Okay, I hope this is what you've done. You should have gone, right, well, if in Adelaide it's 9:36 p.m, what's the difference between Adelaide and Perth? And how are you going to find that out? Right, well, you should go over here. I hope you've done this. I hope you've gone, it's plus 2.5 hours difference. Adelaide is plus 2.5 hours ahead of Perth, right? So if we know that Adelaide is ahead of Perth by this much, 2.5 hours, we've just got to take away what from the Adelaide time? We've got to take away how many hours? 2.5 hours, which is really like saying take away 2:30, taking away 2 hours and 30 minutes, and that might be simpler. So I'll just cross that out. So what is the time then? If in Adelaide it is 9:36, and to find Perth we've got to take away 2 hours 30 minutes, what is the time in Perth? You can do that sum. 9:36 take away 2:30. Okay, I hope you did that sum. I hope we did it together. And so 9:36 take away 2:30 is really just 7:06 p.m. I just took away the hours, and then I took away the minutes, and so I got 7:06 p.m. And I'll just write that down here. And that looks like it makes sense to me because, remember, Adelaide is meant to be 2.5 hours plus. And that looks like it is, in fact, 2.5 hours ahead of this time. Okay, guys, here we are. Now you're up to the try phase of the video. You're going to try this one all by yourself. Okay, what is the time in Sydney when it is 9:52 p.m. in Perth? Have a go all by yourself. Thank you. Okay, I hope you paused me. I hope you had a go. Okay, so we should do our lines again. Perth to Adelaide again is 2.5 hours plus. And from Adelaide to Sydney is, of course, 30 minutes plus. So what you should have done is, right, if Perth is 9:52, then, of course, to Sydney should be plus 3 hours. So the Sydney time should be 9:52 p.m. plus 3 hours, which is 12:52 p.m. Okay, guys, I hope that's been helpful. Thanks for watching.